Body part splits seem to work particularly well for older lifters. Hey everybody, I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. And yes, I am fully aware this is somewhat in conflict with the information I used to put out a decade ago because, I really pushed full body for novice lifters back in the day, squatting 3 days a week, benching 3 days a week, all that stuff. Got a lot of younger guys jacked and strong, got through all their noob gains. And, for a long time, due to the powerlifting, I always promoted upper-lower splits because that's what a lot of the best strength programming was built around, conjugate and all that stuff. But as I've gotten older, one of the things I've realized when it comes to things like joint health, everything else, that too much frequency per body part, too much frequency, particularly heavy work on the same joints, we just can't handle it. And I'm talking, when I say older, I'm talking, into your 40s. I'm not saying 40 is old. I'm 47, doing pretty decent right here, and want to continue to get better. But that's kind of the point, right? I want to keep getting better, not get beat up. So the thing is, for a long time, we had these ideas on frequency, at least in the evidence-based side, based largely upon the idea that muscle protein synthesis only lasted a couple days, and therefore we needed to re-spark it more frequently by training the muscles more often. But the reality is, when it's been studied in the lab at this point, it doesn't look like the higher frequency does anything if volume's about the same. There's no additional muscle growth from it. And anytime you see any data showing higher strength increases, it's simply because you're practicing those lifts more often. And yes, if you bench heavy more often, your max bench is probably going to go up. If you do heavy squatting more often, your max squat is going to go up. Why? Because of practice. You are practicing hitting the heavy lifts and you're practicing the actual movement. And those are two important neurological considerations, right? They're very, very important because, again, motor unit learning, peripheral nervous system, all those things affect our ability to lift. Lifting heavy is a skill. Yes, your muscle is the biggest factor. Your muscle and your leverages are the biggest factors, but there's absolutely a skill component, and there's a neuromuscular component and everything else. So yes, more practice at something makes you better at it. And particularly when we're talking about heavy lifts, right? Getting into lifting really heavy makes you better at lifting really, really heavy, and there's even a degree of carryover to other exercises, okay? Westside knew that for decades, right? Westside knew that for decades, and they produced a lot of world champions accordingly. So we have all of that to think about, but when it starts coming to just gaining muscle, it really is about, how much fatigue do we create in a muscle, how much stimulus, how much fatigue, how much work are we subjecting and tension are we subjecting individual muscle fibers to? Are they being taken too fatigued to where they cannot recruit anymore and being done enough times to give us a good training response? Okay? And frequency doesn't matter so much as long as we get the overall work done, right? As long as we get the overall work done, particularly when we plot it over extended periods of time. Okay, and that's kind of what the data is showing. Then the thing to think about, we could make those older arguments against body part splits, but then newer data is showing there's no real disadvantage to them. Okay, the only disadvantage is going to be for maxing out if you're not practicing the lift as often. But in the grand scheme of things, that's only worth a small amount. That doesn't take you from a 500 squat to a 600 pound squat, okay? It's worth a few pounds, maybe 10 pounds, maybe 20 at the most extreme on your max. And we're talking at the extremes. Unless you're ultra elite, and you're lifting 700-800 pounds, 900 pounds on some movement. But barring that, it really isn't that important other than, again, just getting a little better at your maxes, right? Because there's a skill component to it. So when it comes to the gaining muscle, it really is just about creating that fatigue and that stimulus, okay? And when we understand that the frequency isn't as important, and that's what the data shows, we see plenty of that in the real world, we start to realize, okay, this works. And the other thing to think about is, are you beat up? Okay. We also have to think about recovery session to session. That's one thing that's been looked at with that. People will say, well, if you train more frequently, you can lift heavier. on those lifts, because you're not as fatigued throughout the workout. But you're really not. In other words, if you only squat once a week versus squatting 3 times a week, you're oftentimes walking into that next session fatigued still. You're not fully recovered, so you're not necessarily lifting more. Okay? You're not necessarily lifting more unless the volumes are maybe extremely low. So even then, though, what advantage then are you getting? If the work itself isn't higher per week, probably not as big of a deal. So when we start looking at the nuance, you have to consider that, but then we also have to consider the recovery end. Okay? If you're beat up because you're doing some of these big lifts too often, well, you can't train as hard. If you're beat up because you're getting too much inflammation and your injuries start going up, we start getting hurt more often, start getting pulls, tears, things like that. Guess what? Well, that's going to produce less results over time also. And so one of the things that I've noted as we get older, hitting a lot of these movement patterns and particularly hammering certain joints at specific angles, if we reduce the frequency of it, they handle it better. Okay? Because that is one of the things that we do fight as we get older. People are like, well, you could just do TRT or whatever and replace the testosterone. Yeah, but that doesn't speed up joint recovery. Okay? Testosterone doesn't do a whole heck of a lot to improve your joints. And as we get older, our joints do recover a little slower. They do get beat up a little bit more. So at that point, it really starts to make sense to cut that frequency back. Okay? Get it all done in one session, a lot of times for those muscles and those movements. Be done with it for a week, let it heal, let it recover. And, just get it done. And here's the other thing to think about. If you're recovering better from all this, does it matter? Even if it did produce slightly less results, but we're recovering better, we feel better, quality of life is higher, we're more likely to be consistent in our training. We're also less likely to get those little minor injuries accumulating. Plotted over an extended period of time, even if we were losing this minor amount of muscle protein synthesis, which doesn't really seem to be the case, we're still probably going to get better results because we're now able to be more consistent and consistently putting in pretty hard work, right? Consistently putting in that work over months and years over the long term. That's really where the magic happens. So that's the other thing with a lot of these body part splits. They simply allow for better consistency because of some of that for a lot of people, particularly as we get older. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.